On a summer afternoon in 1943, a 55-year-old officer was sitting down to lunch aboard the safest battleship in Japan. His name was Teruhiko Miyoshi. He had a wife at home and a habit of writing to her whenever he could. At 12:13, the deck under his chair lifted, the lights went out, and the second most powerful warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy was cut in half by something no one has ever been able to explain. No enemy submarine did this, no bomber did this, no shell was fired at her. She died in her own harbour, in front of her own fleet, on a windless afternoon in the inland sea of Japan. Of the 1,474 men aboard her, sailors, cooks, teenage flying cadets who had come aboard for a tour, 1,121 would be dead within 4 minutes. Captain Miyoshi's wife would not be told for another 7 months. This is the story of the Battleship Mutsu and of the mystery Japan buried with her. A mystery still lying, right now, 40 meters under Hiroshima Bay. To understand what happened at Hashirojima, you have to go back to 1920. Back to a country still riding the wave of its stunning naval victory over Russia. Back to a shipyard in Yokosuka, where a battleship was slowly rising from the slipway. She was called Mutsu, after an ancient province in the far north, a region soaked in old samurai history. She was a Nagato-class dreadnought. 215 meters long, nearly 40,000 tons standard displacement, 8 16-inch guns arranged in 4 twin turrets, each shell weighing over a ton, each capable of striking a target more than 40 kilometers away. At the time of her launch, only 7 battleships in the entire world carried guns that heavy. The Washington Naval Treaty would call them the Big Seven. Mutsu was the youngest of the 7, and to the Japanese public she was more than a warship. She was theirs. The construction of Mutsu had been partly financed by a national campaign, not because the treasury was empty, but because the government wanted the people to feel that this ship belonged to them. Workers gave portions of their wages, merchants gave from their shops, and schoolchildren all across Japan dropped coins into collection boxes. Small hands, small copper coins, given to build a fortress of steel that would carry their names across the ocean. The ship they helped pay for would still be alive 23 years later, and on the day she died, those children would be adults. Some of them would be sailors aboard her. For most of her career, Mutsu was quiet. She carried supplies to the survivors of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. She was modernized in the mid-30s, given a pagoda-style superstructure, upgraded engines, thicker armor plate. She sailed with the fleet. She trained, she waited, and when the war finally came, in December of 1941, Mutsu did almost nothing. She was assigned to the main body during the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. She saw no combat. She was assigned to the support force during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons that August. She fired 4 shells at an American reconnaissance aircraft. 4 shells. That was it. The only time in the entire Pacific War that her main guns spoke in anger. 4 shells from 8 16-inch cannons that had been built to break enemy battleships in half. She was a masterpiece of naval engineering. And the war had no use for her. By the spring of 1943, the strategic picture had shifted. The Imperial Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway. Guadalcanal had fallen. American submarines were hunting Japanese tankers across the Pacific, and the fuel that fed the fleet was starting to run out. Battleships drink oil the way marching armies drink water. Mutsu, at full speed, consumed hundreds of tons of fuel oil per day. There was no longer enough for her to move, so she stayed. Anchored at Hashirojima, a fleet anchorage tucked into the sheltered waters of Hiroshima Bay, ringed by low green hills. From the deck of Mutsu, on a clear day you could see the coast of Honshu. You could see fishing boats. You could see farmhouses. You could smell the pine forests. It was one of the most peaceful places in the war. Around her, in neat lines across the anchorage, floated her sisters, the battleship Nagato, her elder sister, the battleship Fuso, older still, the light cruiser Tatsuta, the heavy cruiser Mogami, patched together after the disaster at Midway, destroyers, auxiliaries, a fleet that had once terrified the Pacific, now sitting in the water like a row of iron widows waiting for news that never came. The men aboard called it, quietly, the fleet in a pond. The captain of Mutsu was a 55-year-old officer named Teruhiko Miyoshi. He was not a famous man. His name does not appear in the great battle narratives of the Pacific War. He was a professional, meticulous. According to the memories of the few who survived him, he was a strict disciplinarian who took the paperwork of his command seriously, who inspected uniforms and hatch fittings with equal attention, who did not tolerate sloppy watchkeeping. He was married. His wife lived in Japan. He wrote to her when he could. His executive officer was Captain Koro Uno, 50 years old, a career officer who had previously served as executive officer aboard the battleship Kirishima. Kirishima had been sunk in the terrible night gun battle off Guadalcanal in November 1942, but Uno had transferred off before her final voyage. He had left one doomed ship before her last battle. He would not leave the second. These are the two names that history has kept. There are 1,121 names most of the world has never learned. Among those unrecorded names, in the second week of May 1943, was a young petty officer assigned to turret number 3. We do not know his name. The Imperial Japanese Navy never released it, and no scholar has ever been able to identify him with certainty. What we know comes from post-war interviews with survivors, and from the internal investigation that followed the disaster. We know he was young. We know he was a gunner's mate. We know that in the middle of May he had been formally written up for petty theft aboard the ship. And we know that his court-martial had been scheduled at the naval base at Kure for a specific date, the 8th of June 1943. Remember that date too. In April of 1943, the Aleutian campaign was collapsing. Japanese troops on Attu were being ground down by American landings. In response, the High Command drew up plans to reinforce the northern garrisons. Mutsu was ordered to Kure to prepare for a sortie. Her magazines were loaded to capacity, 16-inch armor-piercing shells, high explosive shells, anti-aircraft shells including the newer, more volatile Type 3 Sanshikidan incendiary rounds. Tons of propellant charges, everything a battleship needed for a distant campaign in cold northern waters. She was loaded, and then at the last minute the sortie was cancelled. Attu was abandoned to the Americans. The reinforcements were called off. Mutsu, fully armed for a war she was never going to fight, was ordered back to Hashirajima to wait. She would ride at anchor for the next several weeks with her magazines still full, every gram of explosive still aboard. Every shell in its rack. If the sortie had gone ahead, if she had spent those shells at Attu, if she had returned lighter and half empty. Perhaps June 8th would have been just another quiet day, but she was full, and she stayed full. On the morning of the 7th of June, 113 young men stepped aboard. They were flying cadets, trainees of the Tsuchiura Naval Air Group, the great flight school north of Tokyo, where Japan trained its carrier pilots. Their average age was around 19. Some were younger. They were students' boys, still learning the trade of war. They had come aboard Mutsu with 40 instructors for a familiarization visit. To see for the first time the great steel machines of the surface fleet, to walk across the teak decks of a real battleship, to stand under the muzzles of 16-inch guns, to understand in some vague and awestruck way what the Imperial Navy was. They were not sailors. They were not going to fight aboard her. They were guests, boys in clean uniforms brought aboard for the day. Of the 113 cadets who stepped aboard on the 7th of June, 13 would still be alive on the 9th. 100 would die inside 48 hours, most within the first 4 minutes. The morning of the 8th of June was ordinary. The bay was calm, the sky was blue, the temperature was climbing toward the humid warmth of an early Japanese summer. Aboard Mutsu, the routine went on. Men painted, men scrubbed, men wrote letters home under the eyes of the censors. In the officers' wardroom, preparations were being made for the midday meal. Captain Miyoshi was there, or would soon be. His executive officer, Captain Uno, was somewhere in the ship. Junior officers were rotating off watch and off duty. The 113 cadets, in small groups, were being led on tours of the vessel. They climbed to the pagoda mast. They admired the huge open bridges. They saw the anti-aircraft gun positions. They descended into the working spaces. And that morning one of the groups was taken to see turret number 3. Turret 3 was one of the 2 aft turrets. two enormous 16-inch guns rising out of a rotating steel barbette, sitting directly above a magazine complex that held hundreds of shells and tons of propellant. Below the turret, deeper in the ship, was the crew berthing space assigned to the turret's gun crew. The crew of Turret 3 lived, worked, and slept directly above enough explosive to level a small city. Somewhere in that assembly, on that morning, a young petty officer was going about his duties. He was scheduled to appear before a naval court at Kuri that same day, on charges of petty theft. Whether he had already been ordered ashore or was still aboard when the morning began, the record does not say clearly. What was going through his mind that morning, no one will ever know. At about 11:30, watches began to change. The forenoon watch stood down. The afternoon watch stepped forward. In the galley, cooks brought the rice pots off the fires. In the wardroom, plates began to appear. In the aft magazines, the shells sat in their racks in absolute stillness. At 12 o'clock, ships across the anchorage rang 8 bells for noon. The sound drifted across the water, over Mutsu, over Nagato, over Fuso, and out to the destroyers on the perimeter. At 12:12, everything aboard Mutsu was as it should have been, 1,474 men, full magazines, clean decks. A calm sea. At 12:13 that would end, the battleship that a nation of children had helped to pay for. The battleship that had fired only 4 shells in the entire Pacific War. The battleship whose captain wrote careful letters home to his wife. The battleship carrying 113 boys who had come aboard for a tour. At 12:13, all of it would be pulled beneath the surface of Hiroshima Bay, together in a single minute of fire. And the question of why, the question of who, the question of what really happened inside turret number 3, that question would outlive them all. 12:13 in the afternoon. The exact second is not recorded. There was no one left alive in the compartment where it began to write it down. What we have are the recollections of men who were somewhere else on the ship, or on other ships nearby, or standing on distant shores looking out at the bay when the world tore open. They all remember the same thing, a sound they had never heard before, a sound that came up through the soles of their boots before it reached their ears. Deep in the after part of Mutsu, below turret number 3, the magazine went. An old sailor from the battleship Fuso, moored a few hundred meters away, was standing at the rail smoking a cigarette. He would tell the story until the day he died. He said the water between the two ships lifted, like something underneath the sea she had inhaled. Then a white light came out of Mutsu's stern. Not fire, light. A hard, silent flash that turned the paint on Fuso's own hull the color of bone. Then the sound arrived. It rolled across the anchorage in a single wave. It shattered wardroom glass on the flagship. It knocked men flat on the decks of destroyers a kilometer away. On the shore of the bay, fishermen mending nets in a village saw their windows blow inward as if a typhoon had passed through their front rooms. Roof tiles slid off houses and shattered in the dirt. Then the black smoke came up out of Mutsu, and it kept coming, higher and higher, until it stood over Hiroshima Bay like a mountain that had grown in a single minute. The men on the other ships did not understand what they were seeing, because what they were seeing was impossible. Inside Mutsu, in the fraction of a second that the magazine took to detonate, the aft third of the ship simply stopped existing as a coherent thing. The steel of a battleship is meant to hold. That is what battleships are. Layers of hardened plate, armored decks, thick bulkheads, a cage of metal built to shrug off shells fired from 20 kilometers away. Mutsu carried 305 millimeters of belt armor. She could take punishment that would break lesser ships in half. She could not take this. The detonation came from inside her, from the very heart of her strength. Hundreds of shells and tons of propellant charges went at once, releasing energy in a space that was designed to contain a fire, not an explosion of that magnitude. Bulkheads that were built to seal in a compartment casualty ruptured in every direction. The armored deck above the magazine, thick enough to stop a plunging shell, was pushed upward like a sheet of tin. The hull was severed cleanly aft of turret number 3, not torn, not bent, severed. The forward section, 150 meters of ship, began to list immediately to starboard. The stern section, 45 meters of ship, was thrown upward and slightly free, and then it settled back into the water and stood on its ruined end, pointing at the sky. In 4 minutes, the forward section would be gone. In 14 hours, so would the stern. The men in the aft crew berthing space directly below turret 3 did not know they were dying. They were not given the time. Their compartment was inside the fireball. It was not that they burned or drowned. They ceased. Later, when divers reached that space, they would find what remained of the gun crew of turret 3 lying in the twisted metal. Almost all of them, but that comes later. In the wardroom, one deck above the waterline in the forward part of the ship, the officers were at their meal. Captain Teruhiko Miyoshi was there, so was Captain Koro Uno. The junior officers were seated according to seniority, white tablecloths. The clink of chopsticks and the low murmur of professional men taking a meal. The blast wave reached them through the steel. The wardroom did not disintegrate the way the aft compartments did. It buckled, the deck lifted, the lamp swung wildly and then went out. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Some were killed instantly by the concussion. Others were stunned and alive, blinking in the sudden darkness, aware only that something enormous had just happened, and that the ship was already leaning under them. Miyoshi, Uno, the men who ran the ship, none of them made it off. Whether they died in the wardroom, or whether they lived long enough to try to reach the bridge, or the flooded passageways, we do not know. We know that when Captain Miyoshi's body was recovered by divers 9 days later, on the 17th of June, he was still inside the ship. He had not escaped. His wife, back in Japan, was still writing to him. On the decks of Mutsu, in the open air, men had a fraction of a moment. Sailors who had been painting, or walking, or standing watch, were flung sideways. Some went into the bay, some slid down the rapidly canting deck and vanished into the smoke. Some of the flying cadets, the boys from Tsuchiura, had been standing in the open when it happened. A few of them, a very few, were thrown clear of the ship entirely. Most were not. The cadets who had been on the tour of Turret 3 were gone. They had been standing inside or beside the very structure that had just erupted. There is no record of any of them being seen again, not on deck, not in the water, not by the rescue boats. They had been 19 years old that morning. Below decks, in the forward section of the ship that was now listing further and further to starboard, the survivors were in a metal maze that was tilting under their feet. The lighting was gone. Emergency lamps flickered in some passageways. In others there was only complete darkness, filled with the sound of rushing water, the groaning of steel that was being asked to hold shapes it was never designed to hold, and the voices of men calling out to each other. Hatches that had opened easily an hour before were now above their heads. Ladders had become horizontal. Passageways had become chutes. A sailor trying to escape from an engineering space had to climb what had been a wall, in the dark, in oil-slick water that was rising past his knees, then his waist, then his chest. Some made it. Most did not. Steel doors jammed as the frames around them warped. Men on the wrong side of those doors pounded on them until they could pound no longer. On the surviving ships nearby, on Fuso and Nagato and Tatsuta, the crews could hear it. The sound of men trapped inside a sinking battleship, hammering on the inside of the hull, is a sound that stays with a person for the rest of his life. Several survivors of the disaster, interviewed decades later as old men, still could not talk about that sound without stopping and looking away. 4 minutes. That is how long it took the forward section of Mutsu to capsize. If you look at your watch and count out 240 seconds, that is the entire life of a battleship after the explosion. From the moment the magazine went to the moment her keel rolled toward the sky, one of the mightiest warships ever built by Japan was already gone. She turned onto her starboard side. Water rushed in through every open hatch, every ventilation duct, every ruptured seam. The list went past 40 degrees, past 60, past 90. Her 4 huge 16-inch guns turned toward the bay and slid under. Her superstructure, her pagoda mast, the bridge from which Miyoshi had commanded her, all of it went sideways into the sea. She rolled completely over. Her flat bottom appeared for a moment, gleaming with wet paint and marine growth, and then she went down. The pagoda mast drove itself into the mud of Hiroshima Bay, 40 meters below. The forward section of Mutsu was on the bottom. Behind her, still floating, was the amputated stern. The 45-meter stern section did not sink immediately. It stood on end. Imagine a piece of a battleship, 3 stories tall, torn free at its ragged forward edge, upended in the water like a broken tombstone. The 2 aft 16-inch guns pointed straight down into the mud. The stern itself, the graceful curved stern that had once carried the chrysanthemum crest of the Imperial Navy, rose vertically into the air. It stood there for the rest of the afternoon. It stood there through the evening. It stood there as the sun went down over Hiroshima Bay and the rescue boats came and went with their loads of oil-soaked survivors and their loads of the dead. It did not sink until about 2 in the morning on the 9th of June. 14 hours. For 14 hours, the last piece of Mutsu that was still above water was her stern, standing vertically in the sea, silhouetted against the sky. Men on the other ships said later that they could not stop looking at it, that there was something in the sight of it that they had no words for. Then, slowly, quietly, it slipped under. The bay closed over her. The rescue operation began within seconds. The battleship Fuso, closest to Mutsu, dropped boats immediately. Her captain did not wait for orders. Sailors who a moment before had been finishing their own meal were in the water in launches, pulling toward the smoke, toward the men floating in oil and debris. The light cruiser Tatsuta launched boats. The heavy cruiser Mogami, herself a survivor of Midway, launched boats. The destroyers Tamanami and Wakatsuki came alive and moved toward the smoke. And then, because no one had any other explanation for what had just happened, the destroyers began to hunt. The assumption, in those first minutes, was that Mutsu had been torpedoed. An American submarine, somehow, impossibly, had penetrated the inland sea and struck a battleship at anchor inside the most protected fleet base in Japan. The destroyers began dropping depth charges. In the water around the sinking battleship, in the water where men were swimming for their lives, coated in fuel oil, injured, half-blind, choking, the destroyers began to drop depth charges hunting for a submarine that was not there and had never been there. The men in the water heard it before they felt it. A deep concussive thumping through the sea. Some of the survivors decades later said that they thought the depth charges killed more men than the initial explosion left in the water. This is not proven, but the men who swam through it believed it. Tamanami and Wakatsuki hunted for hours. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Of the 1,474 men aboard Mutsu that morning, 353 came out of the water alive. 113 of those men had come aboard as flying cadets. Only 13 of them survived. 100 boys, average age 19, gone in an afternoon. Captain Miyoshi, gone. Captain Uno, gone. Almost the entire officer corps of the ship, gone. The gun crew of Turret 3. Gone. The petty officer who had been scheduled for court-martial in Kuri that day, gone as well, or so it appeared. The wardroom, the engineering spaces, the forward turrets, the bridge, every station, every compartment, every rank, every age, all of it reduced to 353 exhausted men being pulled from an oil slick. Some of them would live long lives. Some of them would be dead within the year, shipped out to garrison duties on distant islands where the Americans were coming. Some of them would spend the rest of their lives trying not to remember the sound of pounding on the inside of a hull. They were dragged aboard the rescue boats, they were counted, they were carried below on the surviving ships and given blankets and hot tea. They were kept quiet, because up in Tokyo, the Naval General Staff had already begun to do the second terrible thing that would happen to the men of Mutsu. They had begun to erase her. Within 24 hours, the machinery of silence began to move. At the headquarters of the combined fleet, staff officers gathered in a room where the maps of the Pacific covered every wall. The Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, a 52-year-old career officer who had served as head of the First Bureau of the Naval General Staff during the planning of the Pearl Harbor operation, understood immediately what had to happen. Mutsu could not have sunk, not officially, not publicly, not in any newspaper, any radio broadcast, any letter home. Japan had already lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway. Japan had already lost Guadalcanal. Japan had already lost the string of islands the Americans were now stepping across like stones in a river. If the people of Japan learned that one of the Big Seven, the battleship their own children had helped pay for, had exploded in a home harbor without an enemy in sight, something would break. So the order went out, and it was absolute. Mutsu had not sunk. The survivors were taken off the rescue ships in small groups. They were not allowed to speak to each other about what had happened. They were not allowed to write home. They were not allowed to go on leave. Instead, they were dispersed. Most of them were assigned to the 41st Guard Force at Truk, the Great Fleet anchorage in the Caroline Islands, nearly 3,000 kilometers south of Japan. Truk in 1943 was still a Japanese fortress. It would not remain one for long. Within a year, the American carriers would come, and Operation Hailstone would tear the anchorage apart in 2 days of continuous air attack. Many of the men who had swum out of Mutsu at Hashirajima would drown a second time in the lagoons of Truk under American bombs. Others were sent to island garrisons across the shrinking perimeter of the empire, places with names of their families had never heard of, places from which they would not come back. The Imperial Navy had taken 353 men who knew too much and scattered them across a war that was consuming everything it touched. Most of them would never testify. Most of them would never write a memoir. Most of them would simply disappear into the general slaughter of the last 2 years of the war, and the secret would go with them. That was the point. The dead were handled with the same efficiency. The bodies that were recovered in the first days were not returned to their families. They were not shipped home for funerals in their villages. They were cremated in mass groups, quickly, on the small islands near Hashirajima, and the ashes were collected in sealed containers. Captain Teruhiko Miyoshi's body was brought up by divers on the 17th of June, 9 days after the sinking. He was identified. He was recorded, and then his death was locked inside a naval file. His wife in Japan had not been told. She would not be told for the rest of 1943. She would not be told through the autumn as the leaves turned. She would not be told through the new year as the temples rang in 1944. She was finally notified officially on the 6th of January 1944. 7 months after her husband died in the wardroom of his own ship. For 7 months she had been writing letters that no one was going to answer. For 7 months she had probably assumed he was simply at sea on some long assignment, unable to reply. When the notification finally came, along with it came his posthumous promotion to Rear Admiral. This was standard practice in the Imperial Navy, a promotion offered to the family instead of a body, a rank offered instead of a truth. She was one of more than 1,000 Japanese women who received such a notification, delayed, edited, sanitized, wives, mothers, sisters. In villages all across Japan, the wives of Mutsu's crew waited through the summer of 43 and the autumn and the winter, and only slowly did they begin to understand that something had happened that they were not permitted to know. At the naval base at Kuri, in a workshop at the Kamegakubi Proving Ground, the investigation began. The Imperial Navy needed to know what had killed Mutsu. Not for the public, for themselves, because if it could happen to Mutsu, it could happen to Nagato, it could happen to Yamato. It could happen to any battleship in the fleet that carried the same ammunition in the same magazines. The first suspect was the Type 3 Sanshikidan. The Sanshikidan was an anti-aircraft shell filled with incendiary elements, designed to burst above enemy aircraft formations and shower them with burning fragments. It was a new weapon, and it had a reputation, among the men who handled it, for being unstable. A few years earlier, at the Sagami Arsenal on the mainland, there had been a fire linked to improperly stored Type 3 rounds. The investigators at Kuri had reason to suspect the same thing had happened aboard Mutsu, so they tested it. They built full-scale mock-ups of magazine spaces. They packed them with Type 3 rounds. They subjected them to heat, to shock, to every condition they could think of. They tried to make the shells explode. They could not. Even more damning, they burned the Type 3 propellant openly in front of survivors of the sinking and asked them what they had seen at Hashirajima. The Type 3 propellant burned with a white smoke. The survivors said no. The smoke that came out of Mutsu on the 8th of June had been brown. Brown was the color of standard propellant, standard main battery charges, the kind stored in the 16-inch magazines directly below turret number 3. Whatever had killed Mutsu, it was not the Sanshikidan. The Type 3 rounds were loaded back onto the fleet's battleships. and the investigation turned in another direction. It turned toward the young petty officer, the one whose court-martial had been scheduled for the 8th of June at Curie. The one who had lived and worked directly above the magazine that exploded, the one whose name the Navy would never publicly release. Divers had begun mapping the wreck in the days after the sinking. The battleship Fuso, still at Hashirajima, served as their base of operations. The forward hull of Mutsu was upside down in 40 meters of water. The stern was resting a few hundred feet away. To conceal what they were doing, the divers were initially told that they were surveying a ship similar to Nagato, not Mutsu herself. Eventually, the pretense was dropped. The divers were told the truth. They began to work their way through the ruined compartments. They found bodies, they recovered what they could, and in time they reached the crew berthing space assigned to the men of turret number 3. They found the gun crew of turret 3 inside. Almost all of them. The bodies were there, trapped in the twisted metal of the space where they had eaten and slept and stored their belongings. The petty officers, the gunners, the loaders, the men who had worked that turret in the weeks and months before the 8th of June. But the young petty officer who had been scheduled for court-martial that day was not among them. Records at Curie would later confirm he had not appeared at his own hearing that morning. He had still been aboard Mutsu when the magazine went. His body was never found. Whether he had been vaporized in the initial blast, or whether his body had been swept into the sea and lost, no one would ever be able to say. The internal investigation of the Imperial Japanese Navy would ultimately conclude that the destruction of Mutsu was, in their words, most likely caused by human interference. They named no name, they laid no formal charge, there was no body to charge and no trial to hold. The theory the investigation came closest to endorsing was that a young man facing disgrace had walked into the magazine of a battleship and had made sure that the 8th of June would not be his shame alone. We cannot prove this. No one can. It is one theory among several, but it is the theory the Imperial Navy itself considered most likely, and it is the theory that has haunted the story of Mutsu ever since. After the war, other explanations emerged. They came from men who had time, at last, to think. Fukui Shizuo, one of the most respected Japanese naval architects of the 20th century, put forward a different idea. He proposed that Mutsu had been destroyed by an explosive device smuggled aboard by a Japanese sailor working, wittingly or not, for British naval intelligence. It is a striking theory, it has almost no hard evidence behind it, but it came from a man who understood the ship down to her frames, and it has never been entirely dismissed. In more recent decades, an article in the reference volume Warship 2009 suggested that Mutsu might have been lost not to sabotage, not to defective ammunition, but to an unnoticed fire in a compartment adjacent to the No. 3 magazine. A slow smolder that no one saw until it was too late to fight. A newer theory, less accepted, has argued that the explosion was triggered by old depth charges lying on the seabed, left behind by the destroyer Ushio during a training exercise, detonating beneath the ship. Every theory has its problems. Every theory has its holes. The wreck itself, still partially in place beneath the middle of Hiroshima Bay, has never given up a final answer. Between 1970 and 1978, parts of the ship were raised, sections of armor plate, portions of gun barrels. Personal effects that had once belonged to men whose families had long ago been told the wrong things at the wrong times. Some of these pieces are on display today in Japanese museums. A visitor can stand a few feet from steel that was inside Mutsu on the 8th of June 1943. Steel that was there when the magazine went. The steel does not speak either. If you go to Hashirajima now, you can look out over a quiet piece of water in the inland sea. The fishing boats still work the bay. The green hills still rise around it. On a clear day, the light on the water looks almost exactly as it must have looked at 12:12 in the afternoon on the 8th of June 1943, in the last minute before the world tore open. Below the surface, part of her still remains. Some of the dead were recovered during the salvage operations of the 1970s. Others were never brought up. Their names are recorded in Japanese naval archives. The name of the young petty officer whose court-martial was scheduled for that day is not among the names the Navy chose to make public. The Imperial Japanese Navy died in the summer of 1945. The empire it served died with it. Vice Admiral Fukudome, the man who signed the Order of Silence, survived the war and lived until 1971. Captain Miyoshi's wife lived out her days with a folded flag and a piece of paper that had come 7 months too late. The 13 surviving cadets from Tsuchiura, the boys who had come aboard for a tour, grew into old men. Some of them, decades later, agreed to be interviewed. Most of them did not. The war took many things from Japan. It took cities. It took a generation of young men. It took, in the end, the empire itself. But the thing it took at Hashirajima on the 8th of June, 1943, at 12:13 in the afternoon was different. It took a battleship that a nation of children had paid for with their pocket money. It took a captain who never came back to answer his own letters. It took 100 boys who had come to see the ship, and one crew that lived above a magazine, and one man whose name we will never know. And it took the truth. The truth is still down there, 40 meters below the surface. Inside her, she has been waiting 83 years for someone to bring it up. She is still waiting.